They locked me out of the merger, talks like I was some intern who'd spill coffee on the confidential documents, not the woman who'd built half their intellectual property portfolio from scratch for 7 years. But there I was sitting in my office at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday, watching through my glass door as executives I'd trained hustled past with manila folders stamped confidential, clutched to their chests like they were carrying state secrets instead of acquisition projections. I had probably written the formulas for 6 months earlier. Trevor, the new VP of Strategic Initiatives, a man whose greatest achievement was inheriting his father's Rolodex and a trust fund that could buy a small country, walked past my office twice that afternoon, each time with a different stack of papers, each time avoiding eye contact like I was a ghost he'd personally summoned. Then banished the merger. Talks had been whispered about for weeks, hushed conversations that died the moment I entered a room, urgent calendar invites that somehow never included my name, despite the fact that I held more institutional knowledge about our patent portfolio than anyone else in the building. Combined, I was Dr. Elena Vasquez, Senior Director of Innovation Strategy, the woman who'd personally shepherded 23 patents through the approval process, negotiated licensing deals worth $47 million, and once stayed up for 72 hours straight to restructure a failing product line that saved the company from a lawsuit that would have made them a cautionary tale in business schools. But apparently none of that qualified me for a seat at the table when Pinnacle Industries came knocking with their acquisition offer. The irony wasn't lost on me. Pinnacle wanted us specifically for our innovation pipeline, the very pipeline I designed, optimized, and protected like a mother bear guarding cubs, yet somehow the conversations about selling that pipeline were happening without the person who'd built it. Brick by intellectual brick. The meeting invite finally came at 4:23 p.m., that same Thursday subject line. Strategic alignment discussion, mandatory attendance, mandatory, they'd made it mandatory, like I was a child being summoned to the principal's office for crimes I hadn't committed yet. When I clicked into the details, my blood pressure spiked. Conference room A, tomorrow, 9 a.m., attendees. Trevor Mills, Stephanie Chen, CFO Robert Hawthorne, CEO, and down at the bottom, like an afterthought, Dr. Elena Vasquez. The woman whose life's work they were about to auction off without her input. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was nervous, but because I was calculating running numbers in my head like a human spreadsheet. If Pinnacle was serious about acquisition, they'd need comprehensive IP audits, technology transfer agreements, regulatory compliance reviews, and about 47 other things that lived exclusively in my brain and my meticulously organized filing system. They could shut me out of preliminary talks. Sure, but eventually they'd need me whether they wanted to admit it or not. The next morning, I walked into conference room A at exactly 9 a.m. wearing my navy blazer, the one I'd bought to celebrate my promotion to senior director 3 years ago when I still believed competence and loyalty mattered more than politics and nepotism. Trevor was already seated at the head of the table because, of course, he was flanked by Stephanie and Robert like some corporate holy trinity. I took the seat at the far end, the one usually reserved for note takers and junior staff members. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Robert cleared his throat and launched into what sounded like a rehearsed monologue about market opportunities and strategic positioning, while Trevor nodded along like a bobblehead programmed to agree with authority. 15 minutes in, I realized they weren't briefing me. They were informing me the deal was essentially done pending due diligence. Pinnacle would acquire our innovation division for $2.8 billion in cash and stock. Our entire team would transition under Pinnacle's R&D umbrella with minimal disruption to current projects. Minimal disruption. I almost laughed out loud. They were talking about my life's work like it was office furniture, being moved to a new building. Stephanie finally acknowledged my presence. Elena, obviously, your expertise will be crucial during the transition process. We'll need detailed documentation of all current projects, patent statuses, licensing agreements, the works. I blinked slowly. Obviously, my expertise had been crucial for 7 years, but suddenly they were talking about me like I was a resource to be deployed rather than a leader to be consulted. How long have these talks been going on? I asked, my voice steadier than my pulse. Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Well, the initial conversations began about 6 weeks ago, but nothing was formalized. Until this week, 6 weeks, they've been planning to sell my department for 6 weeks without including me in a single conversation. Trevor must have seen something dangerous flicker across my face because he quickly added, of course, we wanted to include you earlier, but confidentiality, agreements, NDAs, we couldn't risk any leaks before the preliminary terms were set right. Because I was such a notorious gossip, famous for running to industry publications with sensitive information, except I never leaked anything ever, not even when our biggest competitor tried to headhunt me with an offer that would have doubled my salary. But sure, Trevor, confidentiality, I understand. I said with a smile, so thin it could have cut glass. What happens next? Robert leaned forward, relieved to be back on script. Well, assuming due diligence goes smoothly, we'll announce the acquisition publicly in about 3 weeks. Transition timeline is approximately 6 months. You'll work closely with Pinnacle's integration team to ensure knowledge transfer happens seamlessly. Knowledge transfer, the phrase, set in my stomach like swallowed glass. They wanted to extract everything I knew about our systems, our patents, our ongoing research projects, then presumably hand me a cardboard box and a thank you card signed by someone who couldn't spell my name correctly. The meeting wrapped up with handshakes and optimistic platitudes about exciting new opportunities. I nodded, smiled, and walked back to my office feeling like I'd just been diagnosed with a terminal illness by a doctor who was already planning my replacement. I closed my door, sat down at my desk, and opened the secure folder where I kept my most sensitive files. Patents pending patent applications that hadn't been submitted yet, research notes from projects still in early development, licensing agreements with termination clauses that required specific notifications, partnership agreements with academic institutions that were tied to my personal relationships rather than corporate ones. What I found there was interesting, very interesting. It turned out that when you're the person that actually doing the work, rather than just managing it, you accumulate certain advantages. Advantages that look insignificant until someone tries to operate without them. For instance, did Trevor know that 3 of our most valuable patents were filed under provisional applications that required renewal submissions every 12 months, submissions that I handled personally because I didn't trust anyone else to get the timing right? Did Stephanie realize that our licensing agreement with MIT had a personal services clause that made the deal non-transferable without my explicit written consent? A clause I'd negotiated specifically because I didn't trust corporate restructures to protect academic partnerships did. Did Robert understand that our compliance with FDA regulations for 2 ongoing biotech projects depended on quarterly reports that I filed directly with regulatory agencies using credentials that couldn't simply be transferred to new personnel without months of paperwork and background checks? They'd locked me out of the merger talks, but they'd forgotten that I wasn't just an employee, I was the infrastructure. Hey, if you're still with me at this point, you're clearly one of the good ones, the type who understands that workplace revenge isn't about petty drama, it's about justice. So hit that subscribe button because we're about to get into the really satisfying part. And trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when underestimated women start playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. I spent the weekend doing homework, not the kind they assign in business school, but the kind you do when you're about to become a very expensive problem for people who thought they were smarter than you. I pulled every contract, every agreement, every piece of paper I'd ever signed on behalf of the company and read through them with the focus of a forensic accountant looking for embezzlement. What I discovered was beautiful in its simplicity. When you're the person who actually negotiates deals, instead of just rubber stamping them, you tend to include protective language. Language that seemed routine at the time but becomes weaponized when someone tries to cut you out. Monday morning came like a reckoning. I walked into the office carrying a leather portfolio that contained 7 years of carefully documented leverage. I didn't go to my office first. Instead, I walked directly to Robert's corner. Sweet past his secretary who tried to tell me he was in meetings all morning. I knocked once, opened the door, and stepped inside before she could protest. Robert looked up from his computer screen. Startled, Elena, we weren't expecting. What can I do for you? I sat down in the chair across from his desk without waiting for an invitation, opened my portfolio, and placed a single sheet of paper on his mahogany desktop. It was a summary I'd prepared over the weekend. 12 bullet points, each one representing a potential complication with the Pinnacle acquisition. Complications that would require my personal involvement to resolve. Robert scanned the list, his face shifting from confusion to concern to something approaching panic. This can't be right, he said, pointing to item number 4. The MIT licensing agreement has a personal services clause. He looked up at me like I'd somehow forged legal documents that he'd approved himself 3 years earlier. It does, I said calmly, which means Pinnacle can't simply assume that partnership without my written consent, and given that the partnership generates approximately $4.2 million in annual revenue. Through joint research grants, you might want to factor that into your transition. Planning his face was turning an interesting shade of red. What about the FDA compliance reports? Those can be transferred. Surely, I shook my head. Those reports require certification from the primary investigator. That's me, Robert. The regulations are very specific about maintaining continuity of oversight. You can't just hand my credentials to someone else and hope the federal government doesn't notice. There was a long silence during which I could practically hear him calculating how much this conversation was about to cost his shareholders. Then came the question I'd been waiting for, what do you want? Elena, I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd managed since learning about the merger. Talks, I want to be included. Robert, I want a seat at the table during all remaining merger discussions. I want to review and approve any terms that affect my patents, my projects, my partnerships, and I want a formal consulting agreement with Pinnacle that ensures my ongoing involvement in technology, transfer for a minimum of 2 years. I paused, letting that sink in with appropriate compensation. Of course, Robert has stared at me like I just spoken in ancient Greek. Elena, be reasonable. We can't restructure the entire deal because of a few administrative details. A few administrative details. I repeated, my voice still calm, but with an edge that could have cut diamond. Robert, these aren't administrative details. These are the foundational elements that make our innovation division worth $2.8 billion. Without my cooperation, Pinnacle isn't acquiring a functioning business unit. They're buying a very expensive collection of paperwork that may or may not be legally enforceable. The silence stretched between us like a tightrope. Robert was clearly trying to calculate whether I was bluffing. But here's the thing about people who build systems from the ground up: we don't bluff, we just know where all the structural weaknesses are hidden. Elena, he said finally, his voice careful, measured. What kind of consulting arrangement are we talking about? I opened my portfolio again and pulled out a second document. I'd spent Sunday afternoon researching market rates for technology transfer consulting, particularly for acquisitions in the biotech space. The numbers were illuminating. 2-year minimum contract. I said, sliding the paper across his desk. Monthly retainer of 45,000 plus, equity participation in any patents successfully transferred to Pinnacle, soft portfolio plus full veto power over any technology transfers that could compromise ongoing research relationships. Robert's eyes widened as he read, this is substantial compensation. Elena, I nodded. It is substantial compensation for substantial value. Robert, without my cooperation, this acquisition becomes exponentially more complicated, more expensive, and more risky. With my cooperation, it becomes seamless, profitable, and legally bulletproof. Your choice. He picked up his phone and dialed an extension. Trevor, I need you in my office now. Bring Stephanie. We have a situation that required immediate attention. When Trevor and Stephanie arrived, they found me seated comfortably in Robert's guest chair with my portfolio open and a very detailed conversation already in progress. Robert briefed them quickly, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. Elena has identified some potential complications with the merger complications that require her direct involvement to resolve. Trevor, who had spent 6 weeks treating me like office furniture, suddenly looked like he'd swallowed a live grenade. What kind of complications, he asked. Elena has personal relationships and direct contractual obligations that can't simply be transferred. Stephanie said, slowly reading over the summary list. Some of these partnerships are tied to her individual credentials rather than corporate entities. Trevor's face went through several interesting color changes. But what does that mean for the timeline, he asked. It means, I said, leaning forward, that Pinnacle needs to understand they're not just acquiring a business unit, they're acquiring an ecosystem of relationships, patents, research, partnerships, regulatory compliance, and intellectual property that requires ongoing stewardship, not just ownership. And stewardship, I continued, has a price. Trevor looked like he wanted to argue, but Stephanie, the CFO, was already running numbers in her head. I could see her calculating potential delays, regulatory complications, the cost of unwinding partnerships versus the cost of keeping me happy. Elena, she said finally, what would it take to ensure a smooth transition? I smiled because finally someone was asking the right question. It would take recognition that this acquisition succeeds or fails based on intellectual property assets that I've personally developed and protected for 7 years. It would take acknowledgement that my expertise isn't just valuable during transition, it's essential for long-term success, and it would take a formal agreement that reflects both my contribution and my ongoing value to Pinnacle's innovation strategy. I pulled out the third document from my portfolio, a consulting contract I drafted with help from a lawyer friend who specialized in tech acquisitions. The terms were generous but not unreasonable, 2 years guaranteed. Involvement, equity, participation in successfully transferred patents, monthly compensation that reflected my actual value rather than corporate budget constraints, and most importantly, decision-making authority over how my life's work would be integrated into Pinnacle's existing structure. Robert read through the contract twice before speaking. Elena, this changes the entire dynamic of our relationship with Pinnacle. It changes it from an acquisition to a strategic partnership. I agreed. which is what it should have been from the beginning. Robert, you're not just selling assets, you're transferring knowledge, and knowledge requires ongoing relationships with the person who developed it. Trevor finally found his voice, but the board has already approved the basic terms of the acquisition. If we start adding consulting contracts and equity participation, it could delay everything by months. I turned to face him directly. Trevor, the board approved terms based on the assumption that all intellectual property could be cleanly transferred to Pinnacle without complications. But intellectual property isn't like real estate. You can't just hand over a deed and walk away. It requires ongoing development, protection, strategic planning, and someone who understands how all the pieces fit together. You want me to hand over 7 years of my life's work to strangers and trust that they'll figure it out as they go. Or you can include me in the process, ensure continuity, and guarantee that Pinnacle gets what they're actually paying for. Trevor opened his mouth to argue, but Stephanie cut him off. Elena's right, she said flatly. If we try to transfer this portfolio without her direct involvement, we're exposing Pinnacle to enormous risk, patent challenges, regulatory delays, partnership disputes. Any one of those could cost more than her consulting fee, and frankly, if I were Pinnacle's CFO, I'd insist on continuity agreements for key personnel. Robert leaned back in his chair, looking like a man who just realized he'd been playing poker with someone who knew all his cards. Elena, what happens if we say no? I met his gaze steadily. Then you proceed with the acquisition as planned and deal with the consequences. When Pinnacle's due diligence team discovers that half their intellectual property assets come with complications, you didn't disclose, you explained to their lawyers why the MIT partnership might not transfer cleanly, you handle the FDA compliance issues when their team realizes they don't have certified oversight for ongoing biotech projects, and you hope that none of our academic partners decide to terminate their agreements during the transition period, which several of them can do with 60 days. Notice if they determine that corporate restructuring compromises research integrity. The room went very quiet. You mean you'd sabotage the deal? Trevor asked, his voice tight with accusation. I laughed once, short and sharp, Trevor. I wouldn't need to sabotage anything. I'd just stop fixing problems that aren't technically my responsibility anymore. The problems I've been quietly handling for 7 years because I cared about protecting our partnerships, maintaining our reputation, ensuring regulatory compliance. But if I'm not included in planning the transition, why would I feel obligated to clean up the mess when things go wrong? The silence that followed was profound. I could see them processing the implications, realizing that their careful plans had a single point of failure sitting right across from them. Robert finally spoke. Elena, give us 24 hours to discuss this internally. I stood up, collected my documents, and headed for the door. Take all the time you need, Robert. But remember, Pinnacle's due diligence team arrives Monday. They'll want to review all intellectual property assets, including partnership agreements, regulatory compliance records, and technology transfer protocols. I paused at the door, smiling. It would be unfortunate if they discovered complications that could have been easily avoided with proper planning. As I walked back to my office, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. They'd tried to exclude me from decisions about my own work, but they'd forgotten something crucial in corporate acquisitions. The person who built the system usually holds the keys to dismantling it. 2, the call came at 8:30 the next morning, Robert's voice tight but resigned. Elena, we'd like to schedule a meeting with Pinnacle's leadership team to discuss your ongoing involvement in the acquisition. They want to meet with you directly before finalizing terms. I smiled into the phone. Of course they do, Robert. Intellectual property acquisitions require intellectual property expertise, something that's been missing from your negotiations so far. When Robert, Stephanie, Trevor, and I walked into the conference room where Pinnacle's team was waiting, I could feel the shift in power dynamics. Immediately, what had started as a routine acquisition meeting had become something more complex, nuanced, requiring delicate navigation of relationships that couldn't simply be purchased. The lead negotiator for Pinnacle was a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Patricia Hammond, who'd clearly done her homework about our innovation portfolio. She greeted me with the kind of respect that comes from recognizing peer-level expertise. Dr. Vasquez, she said, shaking my hand, I've been reviewing your patent filings and partnership agreements. Impressive work, particularly the MIT biocompatibility research. The pathway you developed for expedited FDA review has saved our industry millions in compliance costs. I nodded, acknowledging the compliment while mentally noting that she'd identified the exact leverage points I'd been planning to discuss. Thank you, Dr. Hammond. I understand you have some questions about technology, transfer protocols during the acquisition. What followed was the most satisfying 3 hours of my professional life. Dr. Hammond and her team had serious concerns about intellectual property, continuity concerns that Robert and Trevor had apparently dismissed as minor administrative details, concerns that I was uniquely qualified to address. We discussed patent portfolios, partnership agreements, regulatory compliance, academic collaborations, and technology development pipelines with the depth and sophistication that the subject matter deserved. Every question they asked reinforced my value. Every concern they raised highlighted the risks of proceeding without my direct involvement. By the end of the meeting, Dr. Hammond had made her position clear to Pinnacle's acquisition team. This deal required my ongoing participation, not just during transition, but as a permanent strategic consultant. She put it directly to Robert in front of everyone. Dr. Vasquez has built relationships and systems that can't simply be transferred to new personnel without significant risk to both intellectual property, value, and regulatory compliance. Pinnacle would prefer to structure this acquisition as a strategic partnership with Dr. Vasquez serving as Chief Innovation Liaison between our organizations. Robert's face was carefully neutral, but I could see him calculating the cost of my demands versus the cost of losing a $2.8 billion acquisition. The math wasn't complicated. Dr. Hammond continued, we're prepared to increase our acquisition offer by 12% to accommodate Dr. Vasquez's consulting arrangement and equity participation. We view her ongoing involvement as essential to protecting the value of the intellectual property assets we're acquiring. 12%, I kept my expression professional, but internally I was celebrating. That represented an additional $336 million in acquisition value, directly attributed to my expertise, directly proving that my involvement wasn't just beneficial, it was financially material to the deal's success. Trevor looked like he'd been physically slapped. Stephanie was scribbling notes furiously, and Robert was staring at me with something approaching grudging respect. Elena, he said slowly, it appears your concerns about transition, complexity were well-founded. I smiled modestly, just thorough planning. Robert, the same kind of planning that built our patent portfolio. In the first place, the consulting agreement was finalized within a week, 2 years guaranteed involvement, equity, participation in transferred patents, a monthly retainer that tripled my existing salary, and most importantly, formal recognition as Chief Innovation Liaison with decision-making authority over technology transfers. The announcement went out company-wide the following Monday. Pinnacle Industries acquires Innovation Division with Dr. Elena Vasquez continuing as Chief Innovation Liaison to ensure seamless knowledge transfer and strategic development. Reading that announcement was better than any revenge fantasy I could have imagined. They tried to sell my life's work without including me in the conversation, but ended up creating a position that gave me more authority, more compensation, and more job security than I'd ever had before. Corporate justice served with a side of poetic irony. 6 months later, I'm writing this from my new office at Pinnacle, a corner suite with windows that actually open and a budget for research projects that would have made my old department weep with envy. Trevor left for a startup 3 months ago, citing a desire for new challenges. Stephanie got promoted to CEO when Robert took early retirement, and I now oversee an innovation budget that's larger than my old company's entire annual revenue. But the sweetest part isn't the money or the title or even the satisfying knowledge that I outmaneuvered people who thought they were smarter than me. The sweetest part is that every patent we transfer, every partnership we maintain, every regulatory approval we secure generates additional equity payments that remind everyone involved that intellectual property isn't just about ideas. It's about the relationships, expertise, and institutional knowledge that make those ideas valuable. They tried to exclude me from merger talks, then had to ask for my approval to make the deal work. Turns out the person they thought was dispensable was actually indispensable. And now every quarterly report, every successful technology transfer, every partnership renewal proves that the best revenge isn't getting even. It's being so good at what you do that eliminating you becomes impossible. They wanted to sell my expertise. Now they pay premium rates to rent it. Indefinitely, thanks for watching you. Beautiful revenge enthusiasts, hit that subscribe button. If you believe competence should be rewarded, not sidelined, and remember the best way to handle being underestimated is to become irreplaceable, then negotiate accordingly.